Last Tuesday, March 12th, 2019, several thousand Newarkers gathered, while thousands listened or watched at home, to Mayor Ras Baraka's State of the City for this year 2019. Unlike its better-known cousin, the State of the Union, which is given live before an audience of elected individuals and their invited guests in the grand marble of the Capitol, the State of the City is given to an open audience of residents of the city of Newark in the largest performing arts venue. Also, unlike its federal cousin, the State of the City included not only a speech by the chief executive of the city, but performances by Newarkers and video testimonials on what's going on here in our city. Here's a quick rundown of the entire program that occurred. We began with an introduction and a welcome by a young Newarker. Then there was an invocation by a member of the clergy. There was a rendition of the United States national anthem by what seemed to be the youngest singer I've ever seen sing it. Then we had a song and interpretive dance of the classic Lift Every Voice and Sing. We had a poem. We had a video entitled We Are Newark. Then we had the speech by the mayor himself. And finally, we had a closing benediction by another member of the clergy. I didn't time it precisely, but the entire presentation clocked around, 3 hours. By far, the crux of the State of the City was the speech given by Mayor Baraka. He began with an all-too-prophetic quote by Martin Luther King Jr., admonishing us that human progress never rolls on an inevitability. He then shared his personal narrative of how and why he became mayor, what would become a recurring theme throughout the speech. He then migrated from topic to topic, beginning each section with a video testimonial. The sections could be broadly described as economic development, jobs, education, youth leadership, public safety, quality of life. He ended with an enthusiastic and climactic exhortation to the crowd to hold the line. Here to discuss what was covered at the State of the City, we have Halashon Sianipar, a resident in Newark who has written pieces about education and politics in Newark. So basically today's discussion is going to be Halashon and I going back and forth and talking about what we saw. And I figured we could start off with just, a general impression of the whole entire presentation from the welcome down to the closing benediction. So what did you think?
It kept me interested the whole time. I thought it was pretty good. I have to admit, I did not watch the State of the Union, the federal cousin, so I have nothing to compare it to. But I was engaged the whole time.
Yeah, there's definitely was never a boring moment. It felt like a performance at NJPAC, and longer than most. I've been to concerts there that have only clocked in at like an hour and a half or 2 hours at most. And this definitely was, from beginning to end, a show.
Like the video, the breaking up with the videos, I thought that was a good touch. I don't know if he usually does that, but it really made the subject stick out in my head that way.
Yeah. For full disclosure, Potter Market was actually invited, and we did attend as members of the press, and we sat in the press box. And for me, I had only ever read the State of the City before. I've never seen it. And it was a very different experience to see it, because it is a speech proper, like the State of the Union. The mayor is speaking. He has a tone. He has presence. He even had an outfit that was very interesting and maybe worth commenting on. And that's very much not the same as reading the dry words on a page that I usually do for the State of the City, just because I'm a faster reader than listener. And it was. You being there, you felt the energy for sure. There was no doubt there was any energy. Did you feel that by watching it away? What did you think about the energy? Was it appropriate or?
Yeah, it seemed like it.
Yeah, it was weird for me because I'm so used to speeches being not necessarily toned down, but the videos were cool, but they did chop up the speech. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on the video? Like you said, the videos you thought were good.
Yeah, I thought they were good because then he would speak about it right after. So for me, it really helped me think about what he's talking about.
Yeah, and I think for me, it did help because I was taking notes the whole time. It did help space out my notes because I knew we were moving on from economic development to jobs and then to education. Although I felt some things kind of did bleed into each other. Maybe there was a little repetition. But before we move on to the core of the speech, was there any other part that you thought was interesting that was outside the speech that you saw?
I didn't really watch. Like somebody sent me the link to the Facebook So like I started watching, I think it was Facebook Live. So I started watching some of that, and then I watched the rest of it yesterday. So I didn't quite see the whole thing, but I did like the poet because I saw that twice. So it was kind of cool. Like it was it was a very visual poem.
Yeah, she had a great line. Let's see, where did I? Oh, your God and your order, which I think was one of my favorite lines I've ever heard in a Newark-based poem. And I think I know exactly what. I think I've been to the restaurant she was talking about, and it was very evocative. And I think its placement right before the video that then led into the speech was clever because it kind of gave it a forward momentum in a way that if you just go from the national anthem to straight to the speech, there wasn't as much of a buildup.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
Yeah, and a quick aside I'm going to get her name right here. Brianna Cameron, who was, I don't know what age she was. She probably was 4 or 5. She sang that national anthem very well. Keep up the hard work if you're listening, Brianna. I think you definitely have a future as a singer. And honestly, that was by far the most precious moment of the entire program. And just for the listeners at home, I will try to post, if the city officially releases a video, the official video release, and they gave us a transcript as a press release. I'll try to post that on the show notes. But if the city does actually release it officially as well, not just to the press, but to the public, I'll make sure that there's a link to that too.
Well, the Facebook I watched was from the city.
Oh, it was actually the city's official feed? Okay, so I'll definitely put a link to that if they don't have the video. Was it like a Facebook Live thing, or was it?
I think so, yeah. I don't know. Somebody sent it to me on Messenger, but from what I remember, it was a Facebook Live.
Got it. So maybe we could just run through the different sections of the speech. It is broken up into sections. There's this first part that doesn't have a name, which is basically his intro. And it started basically in, I don't know if this was an intentional lighting cue, but he starts in darkness, and then the light comes up. I don't know if that was intentional or if that was a mess up. It was hard to see. His features were kind of obscured. And it wasn't until the lights on that I realized he was wearing that special outfit. Do you know? I don't know if that outfit had a history or if there was a particular.
So I was watching it with someone, and she was like, "I bet you he got that in Ghana." So
another friend of mine said that too. I just had no historical research for that, but it seemed a very, for lack of a better term, post-colonial wear. It wasn't a suit, right? Mm-hmm. Suits obviously associated with a long history of capitalism and Western identity. And the first image I got with the suit was not his suit. I don't know the name for it. And if you follow us on Instagram or Twitter or Facebook, please comment on this episode and tell us what the name is. I got the feeling that he was pushing back on that identity and trying to offer a different look. And his shoes also, I mean, sorry, weird thing to notice, but his shoes were this lovely reddish brown that stood out against that suit. Not to talk about a suit. I mean, his speech was very important, but I found the suit was a conscious choice.
Yeah.
Do you have any other thoughts on the whole look of Baraka on stage?
No, I mean, I thought he looked sharp. And actually, when I first saw him, I thought he was dressed down, Yeah. Because I wasn't really paying attention till the other person watching was like, "Oh no, I bet he got it from Ghana." And then I saw the whole outfit, and I'm like, "Oh, that's pretty fly."
Yeah. And the other thing he didn't have was a podium, a lectern. And that's weird, right? For a speech, you're so used to. For our best analog would be Cory Booker. I think every State of the City, at least the pictures I saw, he was holding a lectern. Maybe I'm wrong, and I haven't physically seen Baraka's past speeches, so I don't know if this is his usual style.
I feel like I've had to see at least one, and I thought he was behind one.
Okay, so this may be something new for him then.
I think so. I mean, I can't remember if I saw last year's or not, but I have seen him give him a State of the City type thing before, and he looked more traditional, I guess.
Yeah. So he began with so obviously he comes out on stage. He begins with this interesting story that I think is actually worth commenting on because it's not part of Newark's policies or anything, but I think it informs what he's trying to do. He was at National My Brother's Keeper. I think it's an Obama founded organization, and he talked about there was a protest outside. And I think he described it as saying they wanted more from Barack Obama, the protesters. And he basically talked about how he criticized these protesters for targeting Obama. Not that I think Baraka, still made clear that he didn't necessarily agree with all of Obama's policies, but he was upset for them disrupting the event. Why do you think he included that story? Like, what were your thoughts?
I mean, that point I felt like was kind of throughout the speech.
Yeah.
So that was odd to me because I felt like when he wasn't in office, he was one of those people protesting.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like, are you saying that what you used to do was wrong? Like, I don't think he would say that. So it's like, I don't know. I remember when he was running and he was talking about, like, I need you guys to make the noise because I have all these other forces pushing on me, right? Corporate forces, whatever. So I don't know if that's like he has to do that, but it kind of seems like be like, okay, yeah, thanks for your input here. Like to me, it's all part of the input of residents.
Yeah, it was interesting because this is going to come up later. I think we're going to talk about this, but like his relationship to people who are criticizing what he's trying to do or what other people who are trying to help people of color, urban environments. There's definitely that theme running through, but it was a really weird place to begin because if anything, you associate Baraka and his family with a history of protest, of counterculture, for lack of a better term. And just to be like, no, like, waving his finger, like, you guys have got it wrong was kind of interesting. And he said this line, which I thought was fascinating. Those who say they are the clearest are often the most confused. I don't know if that's exact wording, but this is what I have in my notes. And then he kind of, from there, started talking about his own personal history. He's a Howard University alum. Mm-hmm. He graduated, I think, in '89, which is weirdly the year of my birth. And he talked about storming. The funny thing is now that he has the flips, this is exactly what you mentioned. He talked about storming the administration building.
Right.
Do you remember what I can't remember. I don't have it down here. Do you know what he was trying to get from them?
I forgot now too.
Oh wait,
I've actually heard him say this story more than once. Too.
No, it just came back to me because it's a big thing in the news. It's Lee Atwater. He wanted Lee Atwater off the board of Howard, which is a great. I did not know this history. I didn't realize Lee Atwater was on the board of Howard University. And I think what else did he talk about? He talked about his. He described his own history as activist. Mm-hmm. He talked about singing at City Hall. Do you know what he meant by that?
I don't really remember that line.
Yeah, I think I have here in my notes. I'm trying to remember it as best as I can. I think he meant that he led people singing as a form of protest.
Okay.
In City Hall.
That makes sense.
He talked about peace with street gangs, which is a common theme or common thing that he did as well. Became mayor of the oldest and most important city of the country. And he won with 70% of the vote in last year. Was it 2018, the election? I'm losing my mind here.
I believe so.
Yeah. And then he talked about that people shouldn't just be activists and they should be builders.
That's good. I mean, I agree with that part, but I kind of felt like I felt like he was kind of discouraging the protest part, which I think is part of it, right? If you only protest, I do think that's worth criticizing, but it's part of it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's. I think this is going to keep coming up again. This idea of like, how do you deal with negativity, and what do you call negativity, as opposed to its kinder cousin, constructive criticism. Mm-hmm. And I feel like that was one of the tensions. It's definitely going to come up later when we talk about some other issues. And I just have this other quote here. He said, which is, "Newark is still moving forward, but forward is only a direction." How did you interpret that line?
That didn't particularly stand out to me. So, but he said forward is only...
Again, I encourage our listeners to look at the speech itself to get the lines correct. But I have it in my notes as Newark is moving forward, but forward is only a direction. And I think it was a comment about progress, and that progress is not just linear. I think. I mean, I don't know how else to interpret it. And maybe that has to do with his comments on like, how does Newark develop? And the next thing he mentioned was Amazon, which is like probably one of the biggest news of his administration of the last year. And we already did a podcast, just our last episode, about the Amazon issue. But I don't know, do you have any comments about Amazon and its effect on the city, or the whole bidding process?
I wasn't a big fan of that, actually. I like Baraka. I actually voted for him both times. But I didn't. The Amazon thing was kind of, I put that in the same category of him wanting the casino. I didn't really think either one was a good idea.
Oh my God, a casino! No. And yeah, I think he described that there were backward narratives.
Yeah, I mean, he makes good points. I mean, I never want his seat, right? So I've heard him say, he kind of goes from this, what I consider, it's like a practical angle, right? Well, this is the way we can get jobs now. So what other people are talking about is like pie in the sky, you know? And I think there is some truth to that. But I think the people that are pushing back is how you get closer to the pie in the sky, right?
Yeah.
That's how I feel. So if we're saying, hey, Amazon's anti-union, that's not a bad criticism.
Right.
That's like, oh yeah, you know what? They can keep making that noise because I mean, that was so weird to me when he did the Valentine's Day thing to Amazon, because it was it's like the Amazon guy was just in Queens talking about how, yes, we definitely do not want them to unionize, It just seems like maybe, I don't know. It was weird to me.
Yeah.
I wasn't a fan of that.
Yeah, he ended up talking, to get to your point, he talked about the trolls on social media. And we've been dancing around this since the beginning of the podcast, but I think we should probably just talk about it at this point. Who is he, when he was talking about these criticisms, who do you think he was talking about?
Yeah, just people that that don't exactly see it the same way as him, right? I mean, there's some people I think that he's talking about specifically that maybe are a little more personal, right? Some people they're like, oh, he's a crook or blah blah blah. That's very personal. Right. They're not criticizing his policy. So he could be mostly referring to them, but that's not the impression that I got. It seemed a little broader, and that's what I thought was unfair.
Yeah, and I feel like we could break it up, right? He does mention this later in the speech. He called out RLS Media,
yeah,
which I think everyone in Newark thinks of as the harbinger of doom. I mean, do you have any thoughts on RLS? I mean,
I actually I used to teach at Arts High, so I used to work with him. So I thought I was like, that sounded like that could be personal, because it's really, I mean, RLS is somebody's initials.
Oh, this is an actual person.
Yeah.
Oh, I thought it was like a Russian bot that was just going around scaring people.
That's somebody's initials. I feel like it's wrong if I say who he is. So
no, and I'm not asking you to divulge that. I think you should approach RLS as its own, own thing, and read it for its own.
I'm sure. I mean, I'm not sure, but I would imagine that he started the company, but there's probably all these other people that are involved with it now.
Right.
So
I feel like RLS is in the same thread, and this is part of the history of Newark, and there are levels and deepness below that iceberg of just RLS. I think reminds me a lot of old Newarkers, who've moved out to Belleville, Bloomfield, Union, and their views on what's going on in Newark. And I feel like that's one aspect of the trolls on social media. It's the
okay,
I remember what Broad used to be like, right? And it's changed too much, right? Or it doesn't feel the same like it did in the 60s.
Is that? Oh, okay. I don't really follow RLS that much, but I feel like it's just kind of like quick stories, right? There's nothing like this, right? Where it's you're in depth talking about the topic, right? Is there?
No, there isn't. And granted, I will say that RLS is more of an immediate news outlet in the way that Eyewitness News is for television. And I'm not trying to accuse RLS of doing anything malicious. I'm just saying that the way RLS is also not doing long form stories. It's not doing a podcast. It's not doing what Brick City Live does, not to call it Brick City Live, but I think is an alternative publication where they go into longer depth articles. Mm-hmm. RLS is literally, we heard this on the police beat,
Right.
And like this is what's
Like we
going
get
on.
there. I think because to me, I feel like his whole thing is we got there first. Right.
But I guess my thing is, and not to make this a discussion about RLS, but I feel like it's important to this discussion about the state of the city, is that its only view is a view of, again, this is a rough, like, more of an intuitive feeling than an actual percentage, but I feel like 90% of the stories on RLS are like, X person was shot.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah. Okay. So
maybe
now
there
I
are
know.
feel good stories that I don't know that are on that.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen
publication?
him talk about like when the kids win, like Pop Warner or something like that. I've seen that too. So I don't know. I mean, I think probably the crime stories get more publicity.
Yes.
Maybe
They get shared on Facebook more.
Right.
That's, I think, a definite fact. I think I haven't seen an RLS article on Facebook that was positive.
So I kind of thought that that's what he was referring to. But what I was asking you about is when you were saying like, he's like what when you were saying it's like a perception of like old Newark. So you mean like RLS is sort of this is how people used to see Newark.
Yeah, or how they currently see it. People who used to be here currently see it. That's one of the trolls, I think.
All right.
The other troll, if we're going to break down and parse this line, which may be putting too much emphasis on one line in his speech, are the people who are criticizing what's going on, but who live here, who have a deep investment in this place. And I think that's a major, I don't want to say a theme because it's not his. I don't think
it stood out to me anyway. I'll say it stood out to me.
Yeah. So what do you think about that? So how do you think Baraka discussed the issue of people who, to take an example, MX3 has always been a very contentious thing, and this does come up in the speech at one point. Specifically, actually. I think he actually specifically said MX3, which blew my mind because I thought he would try to dance around it.
And he went and said like, people are complaining like 12 instead of 10 stories or something like that.
Yes, that was it. Yeah, that was the line.
And I thought that was like a little. I thought that was dismissive of like what I felt like some people felt really passionate about it. You know, so
yeah, I agree with. So I have a lot of friends who have a particular view on MX3, going both ways.
Yeah, me too.
We had them on this podcast, and I think that line, belittled them a little too much. If I'm going to take that critique of the speech, it wasn't a difference between 10 and 12 stories. I think that was very reductive.
Yeah, I kind of gave him a pass actually. Like it stuck out to me, but I was kind of at that point. I thought he was totally going off the head.
Yes, that's what I figured. That was all off script and ad-libbed at the end. But I did still feel a little, because I had this like weird feeling. I'm way too empathetic sometimes, for better or for worse, and I will always try to identify with the underdog. And for me, my first feeling was going out to the people who I think were being implicitly criticized.
I mean, because it was originally 18,
Yeah. And like the people, like they have a very big belief on development in the Ironbound and the aesthetics of the Ironbound, and I don't think it's just them, waving their finger and. They're not. I mean, are they outsiders in the sense that all of them were not born here? No, some did grow up here, but a good amount of them did move here. But they moved here with, I think, good intent. I don't think they're, to use a term with a very, very loaded history, carpetbaggers, right? They're not here to extract wealth. I think in that same way, they're here to build homes and live here, and I think they have a particular view of Newark, and I think it's legitimate. Whether or not it's the right view is a different question. But I think they're not malicious, right? Do you have any other thoughts of like maybe who else was he targeting when he talked about criticism?
Oh yeah. Well, he and then he talked about the water.
Yes.
The people outside. I mean, I wasn't there, so I don't know if they were particularly like. Mean to him or something. I don't know.
Yeah. So the line you're referring to, and I have it in my notes here, but I don't want to spend the time searching for it. But he talked specifically about lawsuits, and I remember this coming up because I'm a lawyer by training, and there are aspects of the law I criticize and I think are wrong, but I fundamentally believe in the sort of system of law that has been developed in the United States. The idea that litigation can bring about justice. And to criticize the like people suing, I was just like, they're plaintiffs with injuries. You can't just show up in federal court, and I think in state court too, just being like, I hate what's going on, fix it. These people are people who have been harmed in some way, either being, having children who've, been diagnosed with lead poisoning or or discovered to have heightened lead levels. And I understand you could critique, like, the solution may be to, like, you may have a particular view on the solution, but to say that, like, suing is counterproductive, I mean, if you feel like you've been harmed or you've been disturbed by the city, sometimes that's your last resort. And I thought that was weird because those are, I'm assuming, residents of the city.
Yeah.
I don't know if you know more about, I haven't followed, I want to do an episode on the lead crisis at some point. And I'm not exactly familiar with what's been going on, but I'm assuming the people who are suing are residents, right?
Right.
I don't know. Do you know anything about the lead crisis? Or?
Yeah, now I'm drawing a blank. I forgot.
Yeah, okay, it's fine. No, and like I said, it actually really deserves its own episode. I don't think we could do it justice. I don't think the mayor tried to make it a big part of his speech either, so I don't think it's fair to talk about it here. But moving away from, like, the sort of, we'll come back to probably the criticism, but I just want to see what other parts of the speech that came up. So we had the first video that comes up in the speech, which is about development. Mm-hmm. The videos were interesting because they were, it was never one person, which I thought was kind of interesting. It was always, like, at least 3 or 4 people who had very different roles within that area. So for development, we had someone talk, I don't know if the mayor himself talked about it, but someone talked about growth without gentrification, talking about providing eviction representation in Newark, creating the Equitable Growth Commission. That was a big part of, helping with development in Newark. Equity stakes in minority construction developers, which I thought was an interesting push.
Me too.
And doing the loan and builds workshop. So about that part of the speech, was there anything that you thought that was interesting that came up in the development section?
Yeah, I really like the contractor thing because I've seen him push that a lot, and I think that kind of makes him stand out to me. Like, even so, I went to a couple. Like, actually, I think I only went to one, maybe 2 of those men's meetings he referred to.
Yeah.
And like he, I found him to be very inspiring in terms of, like, trying to get people certified. Like, so there's, like, people there that'll tell you about the process. One of the meetings, he even handed out, like, a list of all the contracts we have, and he's like, if you think you can provide one of these, like, let's make it happen.
Right.
And his idea was, like, like, I'm trying to get Newarkers in these places before, you don't, like, when I'm not here, you might not have this chance anymore.
Yeah.
So I like that about him.
Yeah, and this is not quite the same thing, but to come up in the video, they did do the story of the young man who the city of Newark owned the lot. Like, it probably had been abandoned, and there was a tax lien, and the city probably took it through that mechanism. And then he got to build the house, and they actually showed the video, I think, like a drone video or something of the house. I mean, that was actually, I thought, an effective way to, like, rather than just saying the story. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was, like, an effective way of communicating, this is what the city's actually trying to do. Do you have anything else to say about, like, development, or? I'm running through my notes just quickly to see if there's anything that pops out here. That's when. Okay, so actually, it was during this section that the universal basic income part came up.
Okay.
Do you remember that part of the speech well?
No.
Or?
So that was the weird thing. Like, I read about that in a couple articles. So I was watching it and I didn't notice it at all. So
so for me, it was actually the very next day. If you asked me, like, the one line or one thing you remember from the speech, I think the UBI thing would have been the first thing that came up, because that was, like, for me, the most concrete forward policy thing he was talking about. Rather than talking about things that have occurred in the city, it was a specific policy that he's trying to implement. It was still a little vague in the sense I didn't know the amounts that were, I don't think they came up in the speech. But for me, that was, like, groundbreaking, because I love economics. I follow a lot of economic debates, and the UBI one, aside from, like, healthcare economic debates, I think is the most fascinating thing that's going on in this country. And he talked about having a task force, which is task forces can mean a lot of things. But I think he's trying to show that he's serious about implementing UBI. I mean, do you have any thoughts about how UBI would change the city if we try to do it?
I was actually more of a fan of UBI when I first heard of it, because I like read an article about some like native population in Canada. They did it, and it like really improved their lives. Like they were able to go to school or like take care of their kids. Like so it was very convincing to me when I first started looking into it. But then I started hearing, like, I guess on the left there's like two different ideas. So some people say UBI, some people say jobs guarantee. You know? So then the people that were telling me about, no, we want a jobs guarantee because it's like then you control the means of production, whereas UBI you don't. And I was like, well, that's interesting, because I didn't initially consider that. So I don't know exactly where I stand anymore.
Yeah. I mean, UBI is a very interesting discussion. Like, I don't think it's worth having it here, because I think there's a lot of, for some, UBI is a way to sort of undo a lot of government welfare or services. For others, UBI is simply a means of economic justice, or if you just think of it as a pure growth or a mechanism for bringing people, into a sustainable living. That's a very important thing. What I liked about Baraka bringing it up is, I think because of his history, he doesn't have to defend it. Like when I hear UBI being brought up by a lot of mainstream politicians, I get a little concerned, because it just like
because they're libertarians.
Yeah, well, the funny thing is, I think actually UBI is like fundamentally contradictory to libertarianism, unless you think it's a means, like what I talked about earlier. If you think it's a means to an end to get rid of the welfare state, then it is a very libertarian thing. But with Baraka, you don't bring that same baggage, because I think you can actually believe like what he's attempting to do.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's why I'm actually very interested to see how it goes.
I know, and the only thing I'm concerned is like, and I understand like the city doesn't necessarily have the funds to give out like, let's say 20 or 30,000 a year, which I think is where you start really seeing fascinating things about UBI. That's very expensive. I get that. But if it's something as small as 1,000, I don't know how much that does.
Yeah, from what I read, it was supposed to be, or I don't know about supposed to. That might be an overstatement, but it said something about 1,000 a month.
Yeah, 1,000 a month. Okay, that's interesting.
1,000 a month.
And that could actually save a lot of people from the odd medical bill that like hits the family and could destroy the family, or the rent bill that comes due. Yeah, that's interesting. I thought for some reason I had heard 1,000 a year, and I was like, well,
no.
That'll help some people, but like it could, particularly for people who find themselves in a slightly higher income bracket, that that's only
I think I read that. I think I read that in like NJ.com or something, where they quoted the number.
Yeah. I also have another line here that occurred during this section, which goes back to our earlier argument. We don't have the privilege to rail against development. I don't think that was his words. I think that's just my note. But I think that's like this sort of part of the like, who is he critiquing? Mm-hmm. Talking about the privilege to rail against development.
Right. No, so I've heard him say that before.
Oh, it's a common line he says.
Right. So it's interesting because like when he talks about like people who I would consider like are proposing things that might sound a little more radical, then he he seems to dismiss that as pie in the sky, like we can't wait forever, right? And I believe his urgency, right? Mm-hmm. But at the same token, one thing that kind of stands out to me is I feel like that's kind of a Cammie Anderson argument, where Cammie Anderson was like, kid only gets one chance at third grade, so like I can disrupt the system as much as I have to, because I'm like, I have these kids in mind. But the way it played out in Newark was people are like, this is way too disruptive. Like you need community input. So I thought like, why can't development be the same way, right? Like, why do we want it to be so disruptive? Why don't we get the community input?
I see. Yeah, and well, the funny thing is I would also counter it with the next line that I have here, that like he then said they shop at other places but don't want these things here. Which I thought was a really weird line. Do you remember that line or no? Yeah,
but so like, just because I've heard him talk about it before, I think like when he was talking about people with what he felt like were kind of not practical ideas, right? He's like, you already have a job. He's like, the people that are criticizing me already have a job, but you're not talking to the people out here that are like, Baraka, I need a job. You know? So he's kind of saying like, this is more urgent than what
Right.
you're saying, and that, I mean, I get, like, I can't criticize him because it makes sense to me to some degree, you know?
No, and I think that may be right. I think part of my problem is then like that line itself. I feel like
It doesn't have the context.
Yeah, it doesn't have the context, and it's a weird dig because I do shop at other places outside of Newark. For some, to let the audience know like the things that I'm into. I'm a very big mixologist. I make cocktails all the time. It's very hard to source the ingredients in this town. There's a great distillery here, but that only gives me so much. All Points West, great distillery, highly recommend it. But I have to go to these other places because we don't have those things here.
So wait, no, because I thought his reference is more that, the people criticizing Whole Foods coming here go to Whole Foods somewhere else. So like, why wouldn't they want these things here?
Yeah,
that's what I think he's saying.
So you're saying it's more of the reverse that they don't want Whole Foods here, but they'll still shop at it somewhere else.
Right. That's what I think he's referring to.
I don't know how true that is. I mean, it depends on who you. I guess the problem is who you're.
That's why I don't think it's entirely fair, right? Like some of the people that were anti Whole Foods or whatever, anti gentrification, they're not all doing great.
Right.
I mean, some people are, right? Yeah, that's true. But I mean that's a very broad stroke to me. Like, there's definitely people that criticize gentrification that can't pay the rent now.
Yeah.
So that same group of people he's talking about, like, I need a job now. Some of them are afraid of gentrification.
Yeah.
I don't think that's you can't put people in like such small boxes.
Right. I'm going to put a pin in this because I want to eventually talk about like audience, which I think is like crucial to understanding this. But I want to get through the sections before we get to that. We get to the next video where we talk about building and jobs, or I think officially the section was called jobs. He talked about the lowest unemployment rate in Newark.
I didn't know that.
In the last, 40, 50, however long it's been. That blew my mind. I didn't know that either.
I'm kind of jumping ahead, but
no, it's fine.
Sorry. Like, I think it was somebody from like Rutgers or NJIT, and they were saying like their Newark students going to their school went up by like 80%. Like, that blew me away.
Wait, say that again.
They were saying like they were working with Newark high school students to get them into their college.
Oh,
and it went up by like 80-something%. Like, it totally blew me away.
Yeah. That was interesting. And talking about other youth stuff, he talked about the youth employment program. Just a quick aside, I actually was part of that program when I was in high school. I ended up working at UMDNJ, well, what's now called Rutgers or University Hospital. Mm-hmm. But back in my day, kids, it was called UMDNJ, and that was like a huge opportunity for me. I mean, I worked with the head of the Department of Psychiatry for 2 summers, Dr. Cheryl Ann Kennedy, someone who I still love and admire to this day. That was a huge game changer for me. And I understand that program is not necessarily like everyone goes to work at the University Hospital. There's some people working at, I think Greater Newark Conservancy probably takes some interns. I'm sure there's some other city departments that take those youth to work. But I think it's a very exciting program. I'm glad it got a shout out. And they talked about the numbers being, I wish I wrote down the numbers, but he mentioned the numbers in the speech, which blew my mind. There were like thousands of students getting employed through that program. I don't know, do you have any thoughts on the program?
I mean, I don't have any experience with it, but like, all the stuff he was talking about, like as far as, when you said youth, I'm still thinking about the education part.
Yeah,
which
no,
is
of course.
kind of hard, but but like all the things he talked about, what they were doing with them, like as far as trying to make sure kids from the city go to school in the city and get a job in the city, like that to me, I really like that about what he's trying to do, and I haven't seen any other mayors talk about stuff like that. Like. Where like Roger Leone was talking about how like you're guaranteed
right?
guaranteed a teaching job here when you graduate.
Yeah, that's
awesome.
The new academy they set up. Right?
Yeah,
I wish I knew the name off the top of my head. But that's kind of exciting to have locally trained.
And that's something Baraka was talking about when he ran the first time. So to see that come together now, like I think he definitely. I mean, I applaud that.
Yeah. And there's like this kind of interesting line that he used to describe this whole thing about calling it, this is a paraphrasing, but we are brilliant when the rules are fair.
Yeah, that was great imagery too.
Yeah, that was actually pretty.
With the sports, I
have to tip my hat to that line. Yeah. That's a really, really great line. the idea that like the problem is when society has stacked the deck against you, of course you're never going to succeed. But sports is a place where we have a level playing field, which I thought was a great way of tying all this together. That like this stuff is not happening in a vacuum. It's happening because we're starting to bring equity and justice to jobs, which is fascinating. Do you have anything else to say about the job section?
No.
Okay. So we have education. So we went from jobs to education. They talked about how high school graduation rates are up, which is good news. He called himself the education mayor.
I'll give him that.
Yeah. No. In the sense, he was a principal of a high school.
Yeah. Like I went to, I don't even remember what they were called, but he had these little like community meetings when he first got elected, and they were like, in every little neighborhood.
Yeah.
So I went to one, and like you could just feel like he's the educator, because they broke us up into small groups where you could feel comfortable talking. And I was like, yeah, he's definitely an educator.
Yeah, and I mean, his whole background is like full of education. I mean, not just being was the principal of Central High School, if I remember correctly. He also talked about his own education. I mean, going to Howard, going to St. Peter's. There's another school I'm missing, and I can't remember off the top of my head. But he talked about his own background that was a pretty unique, I think, experience. And they talked about the 3 mayor scholars at NJIT. I think they want to increase that to 200 or some very large number. And it's weird to hear about the mayor and the superintendent. Although actually that's not true, because Cammie Anderson and I think Cory Booker had a previous professional relationship. But it was very interesting to see Baraka shout out Leon. And have that kind of, I don't want to say buddy, but like a very, very like authentic relationship in a way that maybe wasn't true between Surf and Baraka.
Yeah, no, I don't know. I'm pretty excited about what they could get done together, Not just them two, but I'm just saying because they have a good relationship.
Right. And the board will also be another interesting thing, whether, I think the way the board elections run now, it's like either you're pro Baraka policy candidate or you're an opposition candidate. And it'll be interesting to see how board elections pan out this year.
Yeah.
Definitely a future podcast episode, so keep that in mind, listeners. Another great line, make room for black and brown boys, which was an interesting, that was in reference, I think, to the Street Academy.
Yeah, that's also pretty impressive, like when they showed the video and the things they're doing at the Street Academy.
Yeah,
I thought that was pretty impressive.
It's something I have no experience with, so I feel bad talking about it because I'm really talking from pure speculation. But can you speak to just like what is the Street Academy?
I saw the video, but I also I've read about it a little bit. But it just seems like it's somewhat of an alternative education program,
right?
And they help them. It seems kind of like social worky. They help them either graduate or get into a trade or whatever they need. It seems like.
So we go from education to youth, which I think is dovetails with this Street Academy issue, and that was a very stark part because I think that's where he got his most. I don't want to say serious because the whole speech was serious, but his most it was the saddest part because that's where we actually talked about death. And there was 2 stories that came up, one more famous than the other, I think. But he mentioned there was one young person who was, I think it was a male, who was killed by his mother's boyfriend.
Right.
Beaten to death, in fact. And then the second story, which is very famous, was this young woman who was
at a vigil.
It was at a vigil and shot. I mean, this is the cruelest irony I've probably ever heard in my life. And he summed it up with an African proverb, which I think was great, was poignant and really great, which is there's a tradition that you ask when you visit someone, how are the children? And the response is supposed to be, and this was a great line, the children are fine, right? And that was a great, I think, bringing us back to reality. I think, with all the good news in New York, we can't put ourselves in the clouds and forget that, someone was killed at a funeral. Another person was beaten to death, right? And I think that was really interesting to bring that in as you're talking about the Street Academy, as you're talking about what you're doing for young people. I'm trying to see what else was mentioned.
But that was one of the things I liked about him when he was running. He was talking about creating that street team.
Yes.
And I think when he credits that to the crime going down, I believe that. Right. Whereas I didn't believe that when Cory Booker was like, crime's down because blah blah blah. I I don't even
Yeah.
remember. I don't even remember what the reason was, but I didn't buy that. But this, like I've read a couple articles and even I think like maybe one or two studies that it seems like it is very effective. This idea of people that have been through trauma or incarceration or whatever, that they're able to talk to these kids in a way that everybody else can't.
Yeah, no, and I think that was very, very powerful because like you could only bring up so much technocratic data, before people stop listening to you, and you could be as true as you want and be like, we're actually fixing things, but if you don't reach people in that same way,
Like, yeah, like I remember he referenced that violence is a public health issue.
Yeah.
And
yes, he explicitly said that.
and that's when I read the paper, and it was, I don't even remember what university it was, but it was she was from Newark, and it was studying Newark, and they were showing how like violence spread throughout the city. Like it started in the Central Ward where the projects were, and it kind of like moved around moved around like a disease.
Yeah.
And then they were saying that these people kind of function as like I can't think of the word right now. Like a vaccine, because you get a little bit of the disease because they've been through it, but they cure you that way.
Right. And then funny enough that you mentioned that, because then the next section is safety. And it's kind of weird as I'm going through here, something I didn't notice when listening to it, that these sections actually really segue into each other very well. So whoever structured the speech, whether it was Baraka or a speechwriter, like kudos to you, because I'm just noticing that right now. And he talked about community engagement. I mean, there's no surprise that Newark is under consent order. That we have a very fraught history in the city between cops and the civilians, and the government and civilians. What do you think, separate from what Baraka said, how do you feel, what's the word on the ground, if you have any sense of it, about the relationship between public safety and Newark residents?
Yeah, I don't really know. Like, I don't hear, like I'd say my block is like kind of family oriented.
Yeah.
And I don't really hear people talk so much about the police. Like that, they might talk about like, someone down here sells drugs, or the addicts hang out here, but as far as like how police treat people, I haven't really heard people say much.
Okay,
so.
I only asked that because, like, I think living in
and
a
I'm
world...
just way too old to be harassed by the cops.
Yeah.
Now,
No, I mean, that's the sad part, because, like, you live in a world where hashtag BLM is a thing that people talk about. So, and I think similar to the Me Too movement, is it provides a lens that people weren't looking through before. And I just can't help but ask that question, because I feel like that's the sort of loaded
like I feel like
piece in it.
I feel like a teenager can answer that question best, because you're like always on the street walking somewhere, and I mean that's when I felt it the most, And then I mean driving too. Driving is also an issue, but I don't feel as worried driving in Newark than like if I'm driving in, I guess I shouldn't attack some other town, but whatever.
No, I know what you mean.
Bloomfield or Belleville. Like I'd much rather drive in Newark.
Right. No, and I think our listeners who have that experience know exactly what you're talking about. But that is its own podcast episode. So to move away from that relationship, there was an interesting story that came up about safe passage to schools, which I get, but also is like really hard to listen to. This idea that like when I think of safe passage, I think of like an art, like, the Red Cross being escorted through, a demilitarized zone because, some conflict has broken out.
Right.
But they were talking about kids getting to school, which was crazy.
I mean, I like the idea because when I taught, there were kids afraid to walk home from school,
Right.
So I think if these are trusted people in the community, like, it probably makes that whole process easier, and I imagine that eventually it'll just be normal, right? They won't be ever afraid to walk home from school anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, as long as they can keep funding this.
Right. And I think that's part of a larger theme he brought up, which I think crystallized around this line of breaking the cycle of hurt and trauma. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's very rare when you hear politicians talk about it in the language of trauma, which is a fundamentally psychological lens. Instead of like, usually you hear about it in terms of justice, right? Which is, I think these are connected things, but to talk about it like it's trauma, right? What people are experiencing in this city when they want to feel safe is a traumatic experience. And he talked about working with the DEA, with Newark Public Schools, about dealing with students who've witnessed a crime, which is the first time I think I've ever heard some people talk about like, preventing crime from happening, but I've never heard at the Newark municipal level officials talking about dealing with witnessing a crime. Do you think that's going to develop into something fruitful? Or?
Yeah, and the other thing I think you referenced, like I hear people talk about these public safety roundtables.
Yes, yeah.
And I mean, I've never been to one, but I'm kind of curious. Like, I mean, if I were gonna actually give a good opinion, I feel like that would be good to see in person, to see, if people are really, like, if your input's really valued. When you go and talk to the police. I don't know. I'm curious.
Well, I think this then segues into the next issue, which is quality of life. Like, how do we make it better for people in Newark? And he talked about data-based decision making. One of the things that came up, I don't know why this came from the quality of life section, but they talked about Moody's increasing our bond rating by 2 points, I think, which is a big deal. I mean, that means we can pay our bills. I mean, that's something, I think a good development for the city. It means it costs less to get money, which is a weird thing to think about, but it's a way that we're held back from being able to do projects like this. If the city wants to implement these programs, I mean, you could do a lot with volunteers, but only so much before you really do need people with dedicated salaries to doing this stuff. One of the lines that got the most applause, which I thought was fascinating, was plowing our streets. That was like a barnstormer. Like, everyone's like, yes, we can plow our own streets.
Yeah.
I mean, you live in a residential section of
Right.
New York, right? I mean, when it snows, I mean, have you felt like a good response?
So I just moved there. So I'm like I'm off of Clinton Avenue.
Yeah.
So I just moved there, and I used to be in an apartment building. So it wasn't like the streets always got plowed in front of the apartment building. So that wasn't a big deal really for me. But when I saw the pictures online, I was like, wow. So now I would say my street's not plowed as much because I'm not on a main street anymore. But I haven't had really too much trouble with it.
Nice. And I think there's a reference to the Newark's People Assembly. I don't know have you gone to any of those meetings?
I went to one of those.
What's it like?
Well, so that part where he's talking about like you have access to like city officials, like that part's cool because well, at least for me, like a couple times you're trying to get something done, you call City Hall or you go in there and you can't find the person you need to talk to. So there, it's a little easier because like the mayor's right there. So like I feel like in some ways it's like they're putting on a good face, but you also get your question answered.
Yeah.
So I had a particular thing I was trying to take care of. Well, there's an abandoned house next door to me, right? So, and it's city owned. So one, I was seeing like, are there any plans for it? So that question didn't get answered as well as I hoped to, but I'm also getting like rodents from there too. So they treated the area. So that was nice.
That's nice. Wow. And that's through the assembly that you were able to. Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, he talked about it was not fluff meetings, and I guess your anecdote really does show that they aren't. And he talked about making people's voices heard, which sometimes I think is half the battle, right? Sometimes I think this is actually weirdly a critique of his speech as well. When he critiques people complaining, the act of political participation sometimes does mean you just want to voice your hurt. And I think the People's Assembly is about people voicing their own pain or their own disagreement with something that's going on.
Yeah, I only went the one time, but I did feel like there was one lady that was particularly adamant about the issue that she was seeing, and more than one city representative addressed it. Like, we're not just here like pacifying you.
Right.
We want to solve this, and like they took her information. I don't know what happened after that, but she felt better.
Yeah. And this is actually weirdly connected. So this is the part of the speech where we get the one reference to the lead crisis, which after Amazon, or maybe even above Amazon, was probably one of the biggest political stories of Newark the past year.
Yeah.
He does announce a $70 million project to replace all lead service lines, which is great. I mean, for full disclosure, I live in a building unaffected by that. I checked the house I grew up in Newark. It also was built at a certain time when there weren't lead service lines, so it's not an issue that affected me particularly, but something I know that has upset a lot of people, and I think it was good to hear that there's at least some kind of movement.
Yeah.
But it's also the same spot where we got him talking about people not walking in circles. Instead of getting people to hire lawyers to sue the city, they're using it as stepping stones to build their own personal initiatives. And I was like, I just feel like that was not necessary.
Yeah, I mean, it's I don't know, because it's I think that's an unfair criticism. Like people feel a certain way, right? Like, because I look at his career, right?
Right.
And he talked about Booker's record, and he talked about Cammy Anderson. And I don't think he was just building his career, right? Yeah. He was also concerned about that.
Yeah. Yeah, and yeah, right. And but that's how politicians do build their careers through crises. And that's, I think, important. I mean, Baraka built his career through that.
Yeah.
Booker built his career as effectively an anti-corruption, anti the old ways of Newark politics, right? And I thought that was a little unfair because like people are really hurt by that, and I understand that like as a mayor you're the lightning rod, and so you experience that in a very unique way when people are constantly complaining, and you do get like people complaining about stuff that probably doesn't exist or things that like are not actually occurring. I can imagine like he's probably gotten people like trying to like use the lead crisis also maliciously, but I feel like as a whole it's just the language I feel like is just not necessary when you're talking about the lead crisis. But I mean, kudos to them for getting the $70 million to replace the lines.
Yeah.
And this is actually getting towards the end. So
because I mean, like just from my own experience, right? I heard them, and I think I try to be involved, right?
Yeah.
But when I first heard about the lead, like I remember the robocall, like that some of the activists reference, right? That he said the water is clean, but it's the pipes, so like that's confusing, right? I think that's confusing, and I don't think like I think I'm pretty intelligent, so so it's like I kept drinking the water. I'll be honest. I mean, I don't really care anyway. They say that the trouble's for the kids, not me. I mean, maybe one day we'll find out that's wrong, but anyway, I kept drinking the water. And then, but then I had a baby last summer. So then I started getting more nervous, because I'm like, wait, what if there is lead?
You have skin in the game, essentially.
Yeah. So then I called to see if I had, I looked at the map, right? It came out in the papers now. Mm-hmm. And then my house was not on the map. So then I was like, all right. Oh, no. There was something weird. Yeah, my house wasn't on the map. But then when I went to the recreation center, they looked me up and they said, we're not sure. We're not sure if you have lead or not.
Yeah.
Oh no, I called 4311 and then I went to the recreation center and they both said, we're not sure if you have lead or not. I'm like, so why wouldn't you put me on that website that like maybe I have it? Because it just said I don't, like I was fine.
Yeah.
So that was like, I didn't think that was good either. Yeah. And then it took me forever to get tested. And when I finally got tested by the city, they lost it. So
the pipes.
No, you get my pipes tested. Yeah. Then they lost my sample. So then I just got it privately tested.
Right.
Because it was like this is taking way too long for me to have assurance, right? I want to know. So it ended up being over, but not crazy. Like some people had really high numbers. Like, they say it's 15 parts per billion or whatever.
Right.
And mine was 18. But so it's not crazy, but it's over.
Yeah, you're right. You're like 18. Like, what does that mean? I mean, the funny thing is, we're not scientists either. A lot of us. So there are scientists who live in the city, but not all of us are scientists. And for us, it's like 18 over 15. My cholesterol is like something over something, and it's a little.
I'm not going to let my kid drink it.
No, right. But then that's when you become a parent. You start realizing like I wanted 0, not 15, right? But anyway, I feel like lead should really does deserve its own episode. I think we're not doing it justice here, just like talking about it off the cuff. But I just want to move because we actually get to the end part of the speech where this is a sort of like momentum builds up and people start standing up and start shouting, "Hold the line," which please explain to me. I think is a football reference. I don't really watch football. Mm-hmm. And people start linking arms. And he starts building up momentum. There's a weird line. He talks about letting 1,000 flowers bloom. I only call that out because that line has a very loaded history, particularly in Chinese history, where Mao tried to allow people to criticize the government and then quickly crushed it. I don't think that's what Baraka's trying to do, but it was a very weird line to hear.
So I don't know the history behind the line.
So as a student of history, you hear historical echoes all the time, and you get very nervous when you hear particular lines.
Now I need to Google that.
Yeah, it's got a bad history, and I'm not accusing Baraka of any malfeasance here. I'm just saying like that's a very loaded term because of that history with Maoist authoritarianism. But there was a great line. There's a great follow-up line about debating without demeaning, which I think is exactly like the happy medium of like, people should debate topics, but at the end of the day, we can't demean each other. We have to sort of bring some respect. And it just crescendos into hold the line. Build a city that everyone can live in was another great line I saw there. But then it also took a queer, like there was a weird pot shot. I wish I wrote down the line, but there was a pot shot to Booker. And then there was like a pot shot to the MX3 people.
Yeah.
I don't know if that was because of the ad-libbing, and maybe that's the problem with ad-libbing is you start like saying lines that you don't construct as well. Again, like I'm not saying Baraka really is trying to attack people here, but I'm saying like that's the problem with ad-libbing is you end up saying stuff that just doesn't quite, that maybe is effective in the moment, but if you look back historically, it's not going to look great. I don't know. What did you think of the ending?
Yeah. Like he talked about stepping stones, right?
Yeah.
And
yes, no, I have that line here. Yeah, the stepping stone.
So that I felt like that was a Booker shot.
Yeah.
And then the MX3, he said, that we talked about it earlier, but like the 10 and 12 stories, and but it seemed flippant. So,
right. Just sort of wrap up thoughts about the speech. So the first thing I want to talk about is just audience. Who do you think Baraka was speaking to there? Like at the speech, I don't mean this in a literal sense. There were physically people there, but like, who was his prime audience? Do you think?
I don't really know.
Well, because for me, I only bring this up because I myself, this is probably my largest critique of the speech. He was obviously speaking to people there and all the residents of Newark, but it was a very, very southward and westward and central ward focused speech.
I can see that.
Yeah, and so what I'm
that's
getting...
That's true, yeah. That's okay.
And what I'm getting at is I understand that when he's talking about the street academy, when he's talking about economic justice, public safety justice, racial justice, he's not speaking to me, as a white person. And I get that, and that's something I have to understand. But the weird part about it was looking at all the videos, looking at all the references...
Okay, yeah.
I grew up in the North Ward. I spent a little time living in the East Ward. I now live downtown, which is definitely not the normal Newark experience. But I also felt that there was like a surprising absence of certain communities that exist in the city.
Right.
The Hispanic community was not referenced at all, I think, ever. And it's a very large one in the city. There's immigrants, I think, came up in one line. And that's also another huge demographic in the city. And I felt that was left out. And I just... He didn't have to make the dominant part of his speech. I understand, like he could keep the rest of the speech, but to talk about what the city's doing about its immigrant community, was I think worth mentioning.
Yeah, he did have the one line. Yeah, he had the one line something about like it was one of the best cities for immigrants.
Immigrants, right? And it's like that's a whole section in its own right. And talk about why. Like you can't just say that and not explain why.
No, I agree. Yeah.
And I understand it was getting long at that point, but it just for me felt like Newark is a multiplicity of identities and. There's one identity here that's been disserved the most and needs the most care. I understand that. But there's also others that you have to get political buy-in from them. And if they feel left out, I don't want us to revert to the politics of division, which I think is Newark history, even before 67. I think that's Newark history going back to the Great Migration. Or even before that, the first immigrants, I'm sure, coming into Newark were probably spat on and had stuff thrown at them. And I just felt really weird that there was no reference to those. Yeah. The two largest communities I'm thinking of, Hispanic immigrants and Hispanic community, which is separate from the immigrant community.
Yeah, even development-wise, now that you mention it, I don't think they really talked about all the development happening in, say, Ironbound, right? There's a ton of development happening.
Yeah, or this part of the city that rarely gets talked about, I think. I mean, because I'm from there. The North Ward, right? Like, it's another part of the city that has a very different dynamic, but it's still physically a part of the city. And like I said, there's a lot of great stuff that's happening in the South Ward, and more stuff needs to happen there. But to not even get like a little salute, I thought was strange. But like I said, that's just one critique of a larger speech.
Just I don't know. I'm just gonna throw this in there. Yeah. From what I heard is that like whatever. I'm speculating, but I heard that like Adebayo and the Baraka family aren't exactly like really close. So
No,
that could be why he doesn't talk about the North Ward. I don't know. I'm just throwing it out there.
I mean, I think that also has to do with like Adebayo's role in education. I think Baraka and Adebayo have very different views on education. I think there's other stuff going on there as well, but I think, I mean, don't forget Baraka was the principal of a district school. The Adebayo family runs a set of charter schools in the North Ward.
Right. Okay.
And there are probably other divisions going on there. But anything else to say about the speech? I feel like it's a good point to just wrap up with final thoughts.
No. I have like a whole bunch of ideas swirling, so there's nothing that stands out.
Yeah, no, it's definitely, I think the best way to experience it, besides listening to us here, is I do recommend, if you find it's too long, to just watch the whole thing, which I totally get, reading, which I'll post on the show notes, reading the transcript, because the transcript is not exactly what was said, but it's close enough. It's worth reading as a resident of the city. I think it's a launching point for any discussion you want to have about how you feel about what's going on here, because it does sum up a lot of what's going on. But so this is the end of the podcast. I want to ask you, do you have any exciting things in Newark that you want to share?
So we they had this neighbors helping neighbors grant. Did you hear that?
No.
So it was for two neighborhoods. It was for Fairmount and Clinton Hill, and then I applied for it because we're like trying to start a tool library, and then the Office of Sustainability reached out to me, and they're trying to start a tool library. So it seems like it's very possible that it's gonna happen. So I'm kind of excited about that. Like I think that could be cool so basically I got the idea. When I first moved to the neighborhood, there was like a whole bunch of handy guys,
Right.
But like one day, this guy asked me if he could mow my lawn, and he was like cutting the lawn with hedge trimmer, And I like felt bad for the guy. He's like bending over the whole time. He's like, "No, I want to do it."
Oh wow.
And then I just started thinking like, man, we need tools. And now that I'm a homeowner, like I need tools to fix my house because I don't want to pay every time. But so then that's kind of where the idea came from. But then Office of Sustainability wants kind of do some of the same things. Like they were telling me. They saw a model in Austin where they like drive to different areas and like help people fix up their houses and stuff. So I thought that was cool. So I'm excited about that. I don't it's not really hasn't moved forward that much, but the fact that the city reached out to me, I feel like it's I feel a little like it's more.
And what's the name of the program again? Just to make sure that
that I applied for. Yeah, it's called Neighbors Helping Neighbors.
Neighbors Helping Neighbors. Okay. That's great to hear. I myself went to the St. Patrick's Day.
I stopped by that.
That was a lot of fun.
That's like the biggest it's ever been, right?
Yeah, I think so. It's so sad that they don't do it on the weekends, but I heard it's just more expensive and it's harder to do. I wish more people could attend it. The mayor of County Donegal was there, which we had an Irish politician, and it was just amazing to hear him speak. This is not a Newark issue, but he was talking about Brexit, and Ireland's facing a very, very tough history, or a very, very tough future ahead of itself because of its history. And the idea of a hard border, hitting Ireland, it was very resonant in his speech. And it was kind of great to see. I posted a picture on my personal Instagram of Baraka shaking hands and hugging this other mayor from across the Atlantic, which was kind of pretty amazing to watch. But drinking beer, watching the two bands that won the best marching band face off each other in Washington Park was a lot of fun, and I really want to congratulate the people who organized that. It's a really cool thing to do on a Friday, and it was my first year that I had that day off that I could go and watch it. So let me wrap up the podcast here by thanking our guest Halashon Sianipar.
Yeah.
This is Manny Antunes, host and producer of the Pod and Market podcast. Editing and sound engineering by Byphrase. Podcast logo design provided by Robert Conti. Additional creative input by Samantha Catais. Pod intro and outro music by Dan Myler, a human. If you have a subject you would like to hear discussed on the podcast, please email podandmarket@gmail.com or contact the pod through social media. We are on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And I'd like to end with a quote from one of my favorite authors, James Baldwin, in a book that became a movie recently, a movie that I personally thought was robbed at the Oscars, probably should have definitely gotten more awards and should have been nominated for Best Picture. And that book is called If Beale Street Could Talk. When two people love each other, when they really love each other, everything that happens between them has something of a sacramental air. They can sometimes seem to be driven very far from each other. I know of no greater torment, no more resounding void, when your lover has gone. But tonight, with our vows so mysteriously menaced, and with both of us, though from different angles, placed before this fact, we are more profoundly together than we ever had been before. Take care of each other, Joseph had said. You're going to find out it's more than a notion. Thank you.